Some crocheters love them, and some crocheters can't stand them. If you're a crocheter, you might already know what I'm talking about. So in this video, we're going to be exploring the rich history behind the controversial granny square. And if you don't know the story behind them, you might be quite fascinated by it. And even if you can't stand them, you might have a newfound appreciation for them after this. So go ahead and grab your yarn and maybe a cup of tea, and let's explore the history behind the granny square. It's hard to know who exactly was the first to come up with the granny square. The exact origins are a little bit mysterious. Publications like Martha Stewart magazine date the granny square pattern back as far as the American frontier. In the magazine, it says thrifty settlers are faced with a dearth of warm textiles, and that yarn was quite rare back in those days, and that the pattern was inspired by necessity because there was so little yarn to work with and they had to make do with scraps. However, according to Laura Templin, a colonial-era historian for Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, spinning was done by everyone capable, and yarn was often easier for younger kids to make than fine thread. In the 17th and 18th century in the US, neither knit or crochet blankets were widely used. They mostly made bed hook rugs, which are similar to modern latch hooking, and also made blankets from woven fabric. However, it's believed that the granny square has its roots in the mid-19th century of the Victorian era in England. Modular crochet was all the rage, and so were patterns featuring motifs or blocks that were worked individually and then joined together to create larger pieces. Victorian motifs were more intricate and lace-like, and these patterns appeared in Beaton's books of needlework published in 1870, which featured small square and circular motifs, as well as cluster stitches. Victorian motifs highlighted symmetry and geometric repetition, which paved the way for the structured design of the granny square. One of the earliest published references to the granny square type motif is believed to have appeared in the Encyclopedia of Needlework, published in 1884. However, in this context, it didn't meet the exact definition of a granny square for a few different reasons. It is worked from crochet thread, and it does not use the double crochet. It also does not have a pattern of triangles and gaps. However, it might have provided some inspiration for the first ever recorded granny square pattern, which was designed by Mrs. Phelps and was published in the Prairie Farmer magazine, which was a weekly magazine for farmers in the US in the 1800s. The editors ran a specific section dedicated to domestic arts. Because, of course, being able to do domestic arts at this time was a necessity. The April 4th, 1885 edition had a pattern that was called Crazy Work, and about the pattern she wrote, "I've been trying a new crocheted pattern for an Afghan, which is on the principle of the crazy work so popular now. It is made in strips of the desired length and with two of the blocks, which I have brought, forming the width. The long strips are crocheted together with a double chain stitch, which is twisted and of two desirable colors. The small blocks can be sewn or drawn together so as to make a perfect square, this joining being done on the wrong side. The idea is to have the blocks appear as one straight strip. Use Germantown wool, as Germantown wool was a popular yarn brand at the time." And Mrs. Phelps' design choice to use worsted weight wool to create thick, bold strokes of color was definitely an innovative and edgy choice. So she was definitely a bit of a trendsetter. In the 1880s, there was a trend of fiber arts in the US called crazy work, and soon around the world as well. For this motif, sewists and fiber artists made blankets, patchwork quilts, and clothing from pieced together, oddly shaped, vividly colored scraps. So Mrs. Phelps adapted this style to crochet, and it's also good to note that crazy in this instance doesn't mean crazy or mad, but crooked or askew, because they used scraps of fabric to put them together and create this design. And they made use of whatever they had on hand, so nothing went to waste. And here are the original instructions for that square. First row, make a chain of a circle. Then over that, work 12 long stitches and fasten together the worsted by drawing through 2 or 3 stitches and fasten and cut it off. Second row, with another color worsted, start a shell between any of the 12 stitches in the preceding row. The shell consists of 6 long stitches with 1 chain between the 3rd and 4th stitches. Make 4 of these shells and join the 1st and 4th and finish off the end of the worsted as before. Third row, with another color, make a shell of 6 long stitches with 1 chain between the 3rd and 4th stitch in the center of the shell of the preceding row, 1 each side between these shells, make 3 long stitches, finish off the same as for first and second row. 4th row, with the block, make 1 long stitch between each stitch of the preceding row, except at the center of the shell and the stitch on each side of it, putting 2 stitches in each place on each corner. And a slightly different version of the granny square motif was printed on March 4th, 1888 in the Boston Globe by Ava Marie Niles for a pattern called Afghan Crocheted in Blocks, but she doesn't credit any of the specific patterns to other creators. But we can only imagine that she was probably inspired by Mrs. Phelps' original design. Granny squares are seen once again in 1891 in a book entitled The Art of Crocheting. In it, there is a pattern called Block for a Slumber Robe. And in this instance, there's not a pattern, just an image and a note saying, the engraving clearly states the method of making. Then the granny square sort of disappears for a while until 1930, where it's featured in an edition of Fleischer's Afghans, but here it isn't called the granny square either. Also in the 1940s, the complete book of crochet by Elizabeth Lard Matheson also features several square motifs that resembled what we now call granny squares. And at this time, it was common for crocheters to use leftover yarns to create these squares and connect them together to create bedspreads, so an early form of stash busting. They would also create garments as well at the time with the granny square motif. However, it wasn't until the 1970s that granny squares truly rose to fame. During this era, craft books, magazines, and even newspapers in the US and Europe published countless variations of granny square patterns. By this time, granny squares were also used in garments, planters, and pot holders. So basically, granny squares were everywhere. All right, let's take a closer look now at the specific history of granny squares in the US. The granny square really began to gain popularity in the US during the early 20th century. It became a go-to project for American women who embraced crochet as a domestic craft. Crocheting granny squares was considered both a practical skill and a creative outlet, often passed down from mother to daughter. Back then, many families lived in rural areas where making home goods was a necessity. 9 times out of 10, if you wanted something, you had to make it with your own hands. Granny squares were easy and an efficient way to use up scrap yarn, transforming leftover bits and pieces into warm blankets or decorative throws. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, crochet, especially the granny square, became even more important in American households. With money tight and resources scarce, people had to make do with what they had on hand. And the granny square's versatility and thriftiness aligned perfectly with the make, do, and mend mentality. It was all about making sure that nothing went to waste and every bit of yarn had a purpose. During World War II, crochet experienced another wave of popularity in the US, and the granny square was at the heart of it. At the time, yarn and fabric were rationed, especially wool, but there was still a need, of course, to keep warm and cozy. Women crocheted lap blankets, often for soldiers or to donate to the Red Cross. It was a way for people to contribute to the war effort from home and provide comfort to loved ones overseas. After the war, crochet took a bit of a backseat to other trends in the 1950s, but it came roaring back in the 60s and 70s, especially in the US. As I mentioned earlier, the granny square became a fashion statement and a symbol of counterculture during this era. American crochet artists began to experiment with more colors and patterns, reflecting the free-spirited and expressive nature of the time. You could also find granny square blankets in almost every home, and people weren't just using them for traditional purposes. They became a staple of the DIY fashion scene in the US, appearing in everything from ponchos and vests to funky hats and bags. The revival during this era helped establish the granny square as a beloved icon of American craft culture, representing both individual expression and handmade homespun aesthetic. It's so interwoven with American culture that Europeans widely refer to the granny square as American crochet. So it's believed that the granny square, as we know it today, really started to take shape throughout the 20th century, and somewhere along the way got that name granny square because grandmothers were seen as the ones commonly making them and turning them often into blankets, which became family heirlooms. Now let's specifically discuss the granny square in the context of the 1960s and 70s, a time when the granny square exploded into popular culture. It was the era of free love, self-expression, and DIY fashion, and crochet fit perfectly into the mix. Granny squares specifically went from being a domestic necessity to a symbol of the counterculture movement. You'd see them everywhere, from blankets to clothing and accessories and even bikinis. Handmade items like granny square afghans became iconic symbols of comfort, warmth, and homey style. Many people have fond memories of a granny square blanket in their childhood homes, either crocheted by a family member or passed down through the generations. And interestingly, this period also brought a sense of community to the craft. Even long after the 70s, it still maintains its status as a cultural icon. It never truly fades away, but is simply rediscovered by each new generation who see its beauty and its nostalgia and appreciate the versatility of this classic motif. But like many trends, the popularity of the granny square does seem to fade a bit in the 80s and 90s. The rise of mass-produced fashion meant that crochet, especially granny square styles, were seen as a bit old-fashioned. It became something that reminded people of their grandmother's afghans more than a cool fashion statement. After the huge popularity of granny squares in the 1960s and 70s, the 1980s through the early 2000s marked a period when granny squares and crochet as a whole began to fade out of mainstream fashion and decor. The 80s were all about bold, sleek, and high-tech fashion with neon colors, synthetic fabrics, and a preference for mass-produced styles. By the 1990s and early 2000s, minimalism and grunge took center stage, pushing the classic granny square further out of the limelight. However, it's interesting to note that even though granny squares weren't as popular or fashionable, they never completely disappeared. They still continued to show up in homes, often in the form of cherished blankets that people held on to as family heirlooms or nostalgic reminders of the past, and came to appreciate the craft for its nostalgic value. It became a sort of underground classic, something with roots and staying power, even if it was largely out of the public eye. But if we've learned anything from history, it's that trends are cyclical. As the early 2000s began to embrace a renewed interest in handmade and sustainable goods, crochet started to creep back into fashion, setting the stage for the granny square's big comeback. The cultural shift towards DIY, vintage-inspired looks, and appreciation for craft skills was just around the corner, and granny squares were waiting on the wings, ready to make a bold re-entry into the world of fiber arts. And that brings us to today. What was once your grandmother's pastime is now a chic motif. Over the past decade especially, we've seen a massive revival in the popularity of crochet, and the granny square is at the forefront of this comeback. Social media has played a big role in this, with fiber artists sharing colorful and creative takes on traditional patterns, and we've seen granny squares used in all kinds of ways, from intricate cardigans and bucket hats to trendy home decor, and it has been spotted on many runways and celebrities alike. I feel like Etsy has also contributed a lot to the rise of handmade fashion and just handmade items in general. And if you want to check out my video on that, you should see the card above. The granny square has evolved from being a symbol of resourcefulness to becoming a canvas for self-expression and sustainable fashion. The mix of nostalgia and modern creativity has brought the granny square back into the spotlight, and I'm definitely here for it. So why do we still love the granny square after all of these years? Well, it's a few different things. The simplicity of the pattern, the endless possibilities for color combinations, and the sense of connection to our crafting roots all play a part. It's also beginner friendly and eco-friendly, so it's often the first project that people learn to make when they start crocheting or when they just want to use up all of their scrap yarns. You can definitely use up your scrap yarns to create them, and there's just something really special about how this humble little square has woven its way through the generations and continues to inspire us today. Well, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to join back up with me for more videos like this. And if you want to check out more projects and inspiration of what to make with granny squares, definitely check out this playlist up here. And if you want to see all of the dark sides of commercializing crochet, definitely check out this video down here.